fastest acceleration of any bird of prey. Short, rounded wings and a foot-long tail steer through dense forest with unparalleled agility. Yet even she can be outmaneuvered. Other, much smaller creatures here possess astonishing abilities that can defeat the phantom of the forest. With specialized eyesight adapted to low light, the chickadee is first to spot the airborne threat. And first to raise the alarm. A coded message, broadcasting the hawk's position and speed. Squirrels not only recognize the chickadee's call, they've learned to mimic it. Almost perfectly. In seconds, the warning is retweeted from one animal to another. It relays through the forest at over 100 miles per hour. More than twice as fast as the hawk. Message received, loud and clear. Enemy approaching, low and fast. When the little guys look out for each other, it keeps them one step ahead. You don't have to be big and tough to survive. What you really need are friends. Welcome to the world of animal alliances.
I saw the careful editing in that video, and I still have questions. But I also have a sense of wonder, and I think you guys do too. It's not often that a video gets played and you guys want to applaud, but there's something about the majesty of creation in it. What are our 4 pillars here at Daylight Church? I think you got that right. It sounded like up here. But yeah, it's on the screen. It's right there. It's for everybody to see. Service, study, worship, rest. And we're going to tackle 2 of those pillars today, study and worship. And I kind of want to share some questions that I've asked myself over the years that really tore down my faith and then in some sense became the foundation for building it up again. And then I want to talk about worship. And we're going to, it's kind of I'll confess it's a bit of a lazy sermon. I'm going to show you a lot of animal videos today, but with all the editing that went into it, I put in my time this week. It's just not going to quite feel that way from out there. I'm going to talk less, hopefully, which you guys can appreciate that. But one aspect of worship is admiring the artist's work. And I think that's kind of what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about general versus special revelation. Last week we talked about hearing from God and how God wants to speak to you, and that's called specific revelation, is that sometimes a passage of Scripture will open up to you in new ways and change your perspective and change your life forever, or a conversation, or a sermon that you heard, or a podcast you listened to, or a book you read will, like God will speak through it and change you forever, and they call that special revelation, when God specifically reveals himself to people. But general revelation is kind of summed up in this passage from the Psalms. It says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, or the skies proclaim the work of his hands." In the opening sequence of Romans, it talks about how people are without excuse because the heavens declare the glory of God, that you can look around and you can see the majesty of creation. You can see the great artist's handiwork if you'll just take a moment to look. But before we get to all that, I want to make another pastoral confession. This always get a little uncomfortable, but it's this. I am not sure God exists. I think in some churches you say that and it's cause for throwing tomatoes. I think in here you guys get me pretty well and recognize that word "sure" is an important word in this sentence. And I'm not convinced that anybody ought to have certainty or certitude about some of the bigger questions in life, and specifically to claim that one has wrapped one's head around the concept of God is a hard pill to swallow. And so I don't really think when it comes to God or atheism or naturalism or so forth, or Buddhism or Taoism or whatever ism you want to look at, that certainty is kind of at play. I am convinced, I'm compelled, and I'm confident in what I believe, but I'm not certain. And even the word God is kind of a misnomer to me nowadays. I heard a comedian, Pete Holmes, paraphrasing Joseph Campbell with this quote recently. He said, "God is not an old man in the sky. God is a metaphor for a mystery that absolutely transcends all human categories of thought, even the categories of being and non-being. But that's too many words for the back of a quarter." Trying to describe God is trying to describe the indescribable. It's trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. The concept of God is so far above us, bigger than us, beyond us. And so in my life, I'm trying to put this puzzle together and figure out what that picture looks like. And any piece that I can find that fits in the notch and makes the picture a little clearer is valuable to me. And so today we're going to talk about animal apologia. Apologia, of course, is the Greek term that we use for apologetics, which is a defense. And I'll be honest that this word makes me bristle a little bit nowadays. Apologetics makes me bristle. I traveled all over the world as an itinerant apologist, someone who defended the faith for many years. And nowadays I kind of despise that person I was, because I was way more interested in convincing people they were wrong and that I was right. And I just know myself. I know where I was at. I think I had pure-ish motives, but there was something corrupt in the system. I remember I was in London, England, and we were doing this spiritual inventory survey that we were using as what we called an evangelism tool back in those days. And it asked questions about the Bible and questions about belief systems. And I encountered one person who claimed that I needed to talk to their friend because their friend was captain of the debate team and an atheist, and that they were just around the corner, let's go talk to them. And I remember specifically saying, yeah, take me to them because I will dominate them. I said that out loud. That was my perspective back then, was dominate, intellectual domination. Nowadays, that just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel pure or good. I was arrogant and dogmatic and uncool. Today, I'm still pretty compelled by Christianity and the Christian worldview, but I'm less interested in proving right and wrong as I am creating a sense of wonder and admiration for the mystery that is God. I still think Jesus is the big deal in the world, but my perspective has changed on it. I want to increase wonder more than I want to increase certainty. Instead of saying, I used to present all these arguments, some of which we're going to touch base on here today. I used to present them as gotcha moments for atheists. And nowadays, I'm just not interested in that. I think I find it interesting or compelling. But I started asking a lot of questions that really broke down my faith and how I viewed faith. And it started with Big Bang cosmology. Big Bang cosmology. And this is going to be drinking from a fire hose. I get it. We've done this in here before. But Big Bang cosmology basically says that at the beginning there was a singularity. And within that singularity was a kind of reverse limit of sorts as time approached zero, as the beginning of time approached. And the laws of Newtonian physics broke down. And it begs the question of what was before the before. Because if time was part of creation, because time is correlative with mass, energy, volume, and so forth, what was there that was causal? Because we live in a universe of cause and effect. What was causal that existed outside of space and time? And to me, the answer is that it's something spiritual. That may not be your answer. It may not be a popular answer, but that was an answer for me. But when I started studying Big Bang cosmology and a philosophical doctrine called the Kalam cosmological argument that's attached to it, which basically says that there cannot be an infinity of time between us and the beginning, because if there were, it would never arrive at today. And I get it that a lot of this is going to be convoluted and it's stuff you need to wrap your head around. But those changed my perspective, and it changed the way I approached the Bible, because I was a staunch 6-day creationist. The Bible said God created the earth in 6 days. The seventh day he rested. Therefore, it is true. And so even allowing myself to try to wrap my head around these concepts really started to change my perspective on how I approached the Bible, how I approached faith, and it started to kind of tear me down in a sense. And then I studied physics. My degree was in physics. I studied the Maxwell equations, which are basically 4 equations that can describe all Newtonian mechanics in the entire universe. It's like the theories. I've seen the T-shirt that says God said, and it lists the Maxwell equations, and there was light, or there was mass, or there was matter. There are these equations that sum up everything, and I started seeing God in that. And the laws of thermodynamics led to, in my opinion, conclusions that this is not a static universe that has been perpetual, but rather it has not always had a beginning. But I recognized that my physics degree was in, my field of study was Newtonian physics, so once you start getting into quantum physics, man, quantum physics will blow your mind. I think anybody who claims to be an expert in quantum physics is probably deceiving themselves at this point. But all of this put together made me start to see God a little bit bigger. Not a little bit bigger, a whole lot bigger, a whole lot more indescribable, a whole lot more difficult to contain in a box. And then there's arguments like objective morality. Is it okay to torture babies for fun, for example? And if not, why not? Can it be objectively shown that that's uncool? And why is it uncool? And today I find, I used to argue that objective morality exists because there is an objective moral lawgiver. I find some of those arguments a little less compelling nowadays. I think naturalists have some pretty decent arguments in this area. So this is one area where I find holes, a little bit of Swiss cheese in my past worldview. There's ontological arguments. Boy, this gets into some wackadoo stuff, some rhetorical sophistry, if you will. Ontological arguments argue that by pure definition, God is a maximally great being, and that a being that actually exists is superior to a being that does not exist and exists only in definition. Thus, God exists. And again, it gets into some theological wackadoo sophistry, a little bit of word twisting, in my opinion. But if you really want to do some engaging reading for a little while, just Google ontological arguments. They're stated in a whole bunch of different ways, but they used to be arguments that I held strongly to, and now I hold pretty loosely. There's forensic history-ish. I put ish. It's really fascinating to me that specifically the author Luke, when he writes the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts, he states tribunes and tributaries and government officials and geographic locations and oceans and seas and mountains and regions. And my understanding he does so with precise accuracy. He was a historian that did his homework. And so studying the forensics of Jesus and the Jesus story is fairly compelling to me. It's not as compelling as it once was, but it's definitely fascinating. I find the philosophy of Christ and of love more compelling than the historicity of Christ nowadays. But they're intertwined. Without the death and the resurrection, this philosophy of death and resurrection isn't nearly as undergirded and foundationally strong. And so I still find them pretty compelling. There's the 4 L's, the arguments of who was Jesus. Was he a liar, a lunatic, the Lord, or a legend? Man, that used to be my go-to. I'd ask people, what's your take on Jesus? And no matter what their take was, man, I had my answer. I would dominate them. Now I find that a little bit silly. I would just, if I was an atheist, I'd hammer the legend bit. I'm not an atheist, so I don't hammer the legend bit. But I think that's where I'd go with it. But still, I find it compelling of the question of who was Jesus, and this figure that started a religion, started a movement that revolutionized the world. What is the logical explanation for how things unfolded? And in my opinion, the Christian worldview is intellectually justified, if it's not certain or proven, it's justified. You get into the anthropic principle, which basically says that it appears that the universe was designed for us, whether it's gravitational force, the nuclear forces, and so forth, whether it's the animal kingdom or photogenesis. There's so many bees, for example, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. If the bees died, we'd die. And how much of the universe is designed specifically for humankind to exist and thrive. It feels like there was an intelligence behind it with a plan for humans to thrive, for humans to exist and grow. And then you get into the age of the earth and biogenesis. Most scientists from many, many fields now would converge on 4.3 billion years as the age of the earth. For many fields, they would also say that it took, and again, this is all stuff way, way back in history that forensic evidence can't lock down with certainty. But they say it took about 1 billion years for the earth to cool where life could possibly exist, which gives us a window of about 3.3 to 3.5 billion years for life to evolve, if evolution is the process. The problem is that evolution would be so complex, the DNA transitions that would have to occur, the biological mechanisms that would have to change. And biogenesis is so insanely difficult to accomplish when it comes to DNA and genetics alone, that there's this tiny, tiny window for it to occur that makes it statistically not just improbable, but you can almost mathematically say statistically impossible for biogenesis to occur. Thus, people latch on to multiverse theory. They say there's 1 billion universes out there, and ours happens to be one of those billion universes, and it just happens to be the one where that statistical impossibility, which they'd like to call an improbability, occurred. And that brings about images of science fiction to me. There's this episode of Star Trek where they explore multiverse theories, and in it they encounter evil Spock. They encounter another universe where evil Spock exists, and the only difference is Leonard Nimoy wears a goatee and a mustache, and he is evil Spock. And that's kind of where multiverse theory takes you, is that there's a billion, trillion, gazillion universes out there, and in one of those universes, this room still exists, but Mary Jo and John are sitting in opposite seats than they are. And it starts to smack of pretty big science fiction, in my opinion. But it's mathematically, I want to say it's a mystery. It's mathematically proposed and theorized, but unproven. But the reason it gets latched onto is because biogenesis and the complexity of evolution has simply just not had enough time to operate. There's DNA coding, which we'll get into a little bit further as we go on. But it's this idea that your DNA is an encyclopedia of knowledge. And for it to have randomly occurred is beyond pretty improbable. And so that brings us to today, which is, we're talking about teleology. And teleology is the study of purpose or design. We're going to talk about the animal kingdom, and we're going to talk about whether some of the attributes of various animals were designed or not. It relates to questions of evolution or progression, the simple to complex. And so I started asking a lot of questions back in the day. And one of the questions that I encountered that really haunted me was, why don't we ever see trilobites and frogs, or trilobites and horses in the same rock strata? For those that want to adhere to a instantaneous creation, a 6-day creation view. And I see some metaphysical ways to consolidate the two that we're not going to get into today, but it's an important question. Why do the rock layers seem to indicate simple to advanced life forms on Earth? And there's some outliers that make that questionable, but in general, this was a question that haunted me. And so today I tend to believe in some kind of progression, but I also had questions that, so there's these questions that broke down my faith, and there's questions that also built up my faith once again. And one of them was biological explosions. The Cambrian and Precambrian explosions were these biological eras where life went from simple to complex rapidly. Single-cell organisms became invertebrates quickly. And quickly is the enemy of naturalism. Quickly is the enemy of what I've heard some people call neo-Darwinistic evolution. It's this idea that survival of the species and natural selection is the mechanism used to go from simple to complex. Quickly flies in the face of that. There is no quickly in that world. Everything moves slow. So some scientists have theorized an idea called punctuated equilibrium, which is going to be an important phrase as we continue on. Punctuated equilibrium is this idea that minor changes in DNA could create rapid changes in genetics, rapid changes in biological mechanism. This idea that you could have a simple multi-cell organism, for example, and insert DNA coding into that organism, and all of a sudden, suddenly its offspring would be much more complex. And I find it compelling. I find it interesting because as we're going to talk about in just a moment, and I'm going to show you some videos of animals, there's a lot of animals that can be described as having no evolutionary precursor. There's animals that there's just no tree for. There's no. I tend to buy into common ancestry to a certain extent, but there's many animals that common ancestry just doesn't seem to apply. They're just outliers. They're just out there by themselves with nothing in front of them. And the issue is punctuated equilibrium flies in the face of Darwinism. It flies in the face of natural selection and survival of the species, survival of the fittest. It flies in the space of the slow burn process that would be required for naturalism to ring true. And these are some of the things I find compelling. There's evolutionary convergence. There's systems in animals like flight and swimming and echolocation, like antifreeze proteins and specifically compound eyes. I find this really interesting. Mantises, is it manti or mantises? I don't know. Anybody know? I hear from the one teacher in the room. He's a biologist. He says mantises. Therefore, it is etched in stone. Mantises. Mantises, shrimp, flies, bees, they all have similar multi-cell eyes, but they're nowhere near each other in the evolutionary tree. So it's this idea that mechanisms that work were duplicated through the progressive process from simple to complex in ways that were disconnected, which really, in my opinion, flies in the face of any kind of naturalistic Darwinism. It says that there was a designer that liked his idea and used it in various places, in my opinion. It's the same with echolocation and swimming and flight. There's also what they call iterative evolution. Iterative evolution is this idea that there's some species that go extinct and make a comeback later. What the what? We're talking many, many years, eras, eons, where a species has been extinct and all of a sudden they show up on the map again. I have a hard time explaining it, but to me the best explanation is that somebody liked their plan. Somebody liked their design. There's missing links. There's many animals that we're going to talk about that don't seem to have an evolutionary precursor, and they call them missing links for a reason. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on. So you get to teleology, and teleology is this idea that you can look at the animal kingdom, you can look at our own bodies, you can look at biology and see purpose. And so it's kind of the question of what is something for? For example, turtles, what is their shell for? Protection is the easy word that pops out, right? There's more than that, but protection is the clear word. And when we talk about the word for, we're talking about either purpose and design or utilization. Utilization would be mindless. Purpose or design would require a purposor or designer. And it's been shown among even preschoolers that this teleological language of design and purpose flows naturally out of humans' lips. There's a study that's interesting reading called The Scope of Teleological Thinking in Preschool Children. And what they found out was that when a child describes what a turtle's shell is for, they tend to use words that coincide with purpose and design. And they'd have to be really purposeful. They'd have to be careful, almost teleological, to use words that include utilization instead. Utilization would be blind indifference. Utilization would be, I happen to have a shell, therefore I will use it for protection. Design or purpose, the teleology of the shell is somebody had a plan. Some intelligence designed this plan. And there's so many animals out there that I think speaking in non-theological terms or speaking in terms of utilization makes it really challenging. What is a giraffe's long forelimbs and neck for? It's for eating food out of high trees, right? And we'll get into giraffes in just a second, but there's this really interesting paper written by an evolutionist that is defending evolution by saying they need to take a different approach because the old approach of viewing it from the same naturalistic lens doesn't quite work. It's called The Giraffe's Short Neck, Why Evolutionary Thought Needs a Holistic Foundation. And I'm just presenting that as more interesting reading on the topic. We're not going to go through his points today, except to say that when you talk about what is a giraffe's neck for, you tend to speak in terms of purpose and design and not just utilization. I feel like there's, for me, it would take I don't want to say this to say this for anyone else. I'm just going to say it for me. I would have to let go of my intellectual integrity to view the giraffe's neck or the turtle's shell as accidents, as purely utilized as opposed to purposed. It'd be hard for me. Or even eyebrows or eyelashes. I don't know why this is something that I tend to fixate on in these conversations, but what are eyebrows for? Keep sweat out of your eyes and expressionism, communication. And I have a hard time coming up with a way that this occurred through natural selection. Were there bears that had no eyelashes, so they kept getting stuff in their eyes, so they died out? It's hard for me to swallow, but that's the survival of the fittest mechanism. Is it apes that had to actually wipe sweat from their brow so they were destroyed by other predators? It's challenging for me. Instead, it looks like an artist decided, to me, this is how it appears. It looks like an artist said, I'd like to keep dust out of your eyes. Therefore, let's put these lint catchers there. I'd like to keep your sweat out of your eyes, and I'd like you to be able to be expressive. Therefore, eyebrows. That's how it appears to me. That's how I feel. It's teleology. What we find is that, according to Aristotle, that nature does nothing in vain. Now, vestigial organs are a separate conversation, and it's part of the comeback to this. But where are all the failed mutations? They're called missing links for a reason. Where are all the remains of creatures that failed to thrive, failed to survive because the advancements were not beneficial? You don't see them. They're not out there. There's animals with rickets. There's bones that they find of diseases, but you typically don't. There are outliers, but you typically don't find the massive amount of extinctions that would have had to have occurred for natural selection to be the mechanism that controls the universe, in my opinion. And so we're going to talk about some animals here. We've got about 15 minutes left, and we've got about 15 minutes worth of videos to watch. There's animals that, in my opinion, defy evolution in that there's no evolutionary precursor for them. And three of my favorites that I'll talk about real quick before we get to the videos. One is megapodes, or what they call mounding birds. I mentioned them in here before. These are little birds about the size of a chicken or smaller that create these mounds to bury their eggs in. And the mounds can be half the size of this room or a quarter the size of this room. I mean, they're massive mounds that can be 8 or 10 feet tall. And these birds that have a brain smaller than a pea, somehow know when to remove dirt and debris, when to add dirt and debris to keep their eggs at a precise temperature and humidity that if varied by like 1/10 of 1 degree for too long, or 1/10 of 1% when it comes to humidity, the eggs will die. And somehow they know. Somehow their little, virtually non-existent brains can process. First off, they have to be able to gauge the humidity. They have to be able to gauge the temperature. They have to be able to watch the shade. They have to be able to feel the soil and know. And how they do it, nobody knows. But there's no evolutionary precursor for this. There's no other animal that does such a thing. To me, punctuated equilibrium or some sort of progressive insertion of an artist is the only reasonable explanation. Bombardier beetles, these have machine gun turrets on their butts. They're fascinating little creatures that have a mix of chemicals that stay in separate chambers, and when they're threatened, those chambers mix and boom, they shoot out this acid and burn their enemies. And these turrets on their butt can go in any direction. They're almost literally like a machine gun turret. They can aim as they please. And it happens explosively, rapidly. Watch videos, it's fascinating. There's no lead up to them in the evolutionary tree. There's no common ancestor that makes sense of this. Punctuated equilibrium could do it in that there would be DNA coded into a different beetle that would allow the mechanism to develop. But what great writer wrote that DNA? If it was an accident, it's a pretty tremendous and spectacular accident. When we get into giraffes, even animals that we see at the Louisville Zoo that we kind of watch and we think, wow, that's really interesting. Fascinating as far as their biology. They're so top-heavy they should just fall over all the time. The genetic engineering that went into the giraffe's spine and cardiovascular system. Have you ever stood up too fast and gotten dizzy? Imagine you're 28 feet in the air and you bend down to pick something up. Their cardiovascular system is built in such a way where there's valves that open and close and prevent that from happening. And there's no evolutionary precursor for it. It just is. And it's fascinating to me. Next, we have this terrifying little creature that we're going to show a video of. And I do want to mention that we're using these videos under what we call fair use law. I believe it's applicable here. So we're going to show them online. We're going to show them in our online videos. But if you get cut off in our online audience this morning, it's because Facebook's algorithms caught it and said, nope, for some reason, but they'll be back on early this week. Here we go.
In the rainforest, one sharpshooter is in search of its next target. Meet the velvet worm, a nearly blind creature with an impressive weapon. The worm is sensitive to air currents caused by movements and uses this to hunt. The velvet worm moves so slowly that its prey usually doesn't notice it approaching. The worm's secret weapons are 2 pistols that fire sticky ropes up to a foot long. It's like silly string of death. The substance then paralyzes the prey with fast-drying adhesive. The worm also has a knife in its jaw and uses it to slice its prey open. It then injects saliva that liquefies the insides of any unlucky victim. So, to recap, this creature that looks like a scary alien monster and can feel you through the air moves slowly like it's in a horror film before projectile spraying you with its sticky super soaker of death, rendering you powerless to only watch as it then stabs you with the knife it has hidden in its jaws like a prison shank that it uses to rip you apart before drinking your organs. Yeah, that thing is terrifying.
The velvet worm. I saw a mathematical engineer talking about their hoses of death and how garden hoses are kind of a perfect mechanism for covering a large area with a small amount of fluid because they do like this. The friction, he goes through and he shows how the friction affects the hose. And there's a lot of sprinklers that work in this mechanism. They're wanting to cover as much ground as they can or you've seen a fire hose get away from fire workers before. And it just covers everything. And so it's just this fascinating. Now I will say this. This begs a really important question for the theist of why would the God of life create such fascinating mechanisms of death? And we're not going to talk about that today. I just wanted to put it on the table that when we talk about these things, it brings up further questions. It makes things challenging to a certain extent. And some of the animals we're going to talk about have really, really they're efficient killing machines. But there's also some sort of artistry involved in it. And this creature, in my opinion, has no evolutionary precursor. And so some kind of coding into the genetics, some kind of punctuated equilibrium, in my opinion, is the only reasonable explanation. But that begs the question of who wrote the code and how was it inserted. Here we go with another one. This one's pretty fascinating. This one will have to be turned up a little bit, guys.
With luck, there might be a meal of some kind here. There are spiders in the crevices. Not much, but worth having. And there's something moving up there. The bird was mistaken. It was a viper with a lethal bite. This species has only recently been discovered, and so far it has been found nowhere else but here. Its camouflage is so effective that it's almost impossible to see it on these rocks. And on its tail, movable scales have been modified to look like a spider's legs. And its tip like an abdomen.
You notice what he said? He said, its tail has been modified. What does that mean? This is a creature. That's teleological language. And this is another creature with no evolutionary precursor. In fact, this species, they call it a new species in 2006. The first example of it was found in 2001, and they thought it was just a mutation. Then they found a whole bunch of them by 2006 and declared it a new species. Now, was it one that evolved? I'm open to that argument, but I'm saying it involved with some coding. Some artists had a plan. These creatures are the most horrifying things you've ever seen. They've got fishing lures in their gaping mouths of death. If you saw a child with an arm that looked like a fishing rod and lures attached to it and said, "Where did that come from?" And he said, "I was born this way," you would raise an eyebrow, faux show. Coral, the largest animal on earth. Here we go.
Communication. Every year, on the same day, at the same hour, within the same minute, corals of the same species, although separated by thousands of miles, will suddenly spawn in perfect synchronicity. The dates and times vary from year to year for reasons only the coral knows. While one species of coral spawns during 1 hour, Another species right next to it waits for a different hour or a different day or a different week before spawning in synchronicity with its own species. Distance seems to have no effect. If you broke off a chunk of coral and placed it in a bucket beneath a sink in London, that chunk would spawn at the same time as other coral of the same species around the world. You could take a piece of coral, break it off, put it in London, and another coral of the same species will in synchronicity spawn at the exact same time. Coral is the largest biological structure on the planet and covers 175,000 square miles of the seafloor, and it can communicate in a way far more sophisticated than anyone ever thought. And yet coral is one of the most primitive animals on Earth. Coral has no eyes, no ears, and no brain. Is that crazy?
That's insane.
So I'm going to close with 3 quick videos where we just worship the artist. The first is of giant honeybees, shimmering giant honeybees. Surround their hive, and when a wasp approaches, they have this really interesting, fascinating mechanism for fending them off. If a larger creature approaches, if a possum comes up or a bird approaches, they swarm and they attack. If a wasp approaches or a hornet approaches, they don't want them to be picked off one by one, so this is what they do. It's called shimmering. They do the wave. It's like a Bug's Life at the end where, if you haven't seen Bug's Life, it's your fault for this spoiler. But all the bugs stand united against the grasshoppers. They link arms and say, "Not today, pal." That's what these bees do. It's fascinating. If you've never heard of golden pearls, and you're going to see in a moment that they're not all actually gold, but here's a woman taking pearls out of giant clams.
Woo!
She's rich. A man on vacation recently found a $4,000 golden pearl in his oyster.
Wah! Wah! Woohoo! Wah!
And for sake of time, I'm going to cut the video off there, but she opens another one up and finds pearls of the same size, but white. We're going to close with peacock spiders, that when they dance, they attract mates. They dance to attract mates and to avoid being eaten, which are always good goals. And if you've wondered what music plays in the forests of Australia and China, here it is. I think the biological world points to an artist, and that artist is worthy of our admiration. Thus, one of our pillars is worship. In Revelations, it says this, Revelation 4, "Worthy are you, our Lord and our God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and because of your will they existed and were created."